Young Nonprofit Professionals Network Portland connects emerging leaders with resources, people, and ideas. Our vision is stronger communities advanced by a diverse and powerful social sector. This event was recorded with the consent of our host and attendees, September 21st, 2021. Enjoy.
Can everyone hear me? Oh, there he goes. Excellent. We are recording now. All right, folks, thank you all so much for joining. As Kalima and the YNPN folks mentioned, my name is Alex Berry. I'm really happy to be joining you all today. For anyone who doesn't know, this is part of a three-part series that's all around different elements of storytelling within the professional space. I'm super happy to be joining you all today, and we're going to really dive into prepping for interviews, different interview strategies, tackling different types of interview anxiety, and hopefully through our hour and a half together, we're going to go and have you all feeling a lot more prepared, a lot more confident, and just a lot more knowledgeable about how to be able to go and to approach different types of interviews. So let me go and make sure that I can share my screen here, because I do have a few things going prepared for you all. But what's most important is a lot less of my slides, and it's always going to be a lot more of your questions. So I'm going to have Phoebe over here, who's going to help keep me honest to make sure I don't miss anything over in the Zoom chat. So again, thank you all so much for being here. And Phoebe, please keep me honest. If you need to interrupt me or if I'm talking too much, want to make sure that we go and we can prioritize the questions we have in the chat as we go through this. So what do you all need to know about me, particularly for those of you who over at our part one of our session? I go and I run CMD, which is a career consulting company. We are based over here in the Portland, Oregon areas within the greater Portland, Oregon metro. And we work primarily with folks who are coming from the nonprofit and the technology sector. Beyond that, my career spans sort of the big areas of corporate America, as well as serving on 3 different nonprofit boards. Though I do reside over in one of the suburbs of Portland, I'm originally from Southwest Georgia. And so like many of you all, I am preparing for winter, trying to mentally and physically get there as well. The only other thing I'll go and I'll mention is that my academic background is kind of spanning this weird sort of engineering world, sort of the business nonprofit world, and then this sort of weird area of linguistics with learning Mandarin and understanding how the culture translates to the business and how the business translates to the technology. And so a lot of what I get to go and to do with people, many of them like yourselves, is helping to figure out how you can take all of these different elements that make up the parts of your story and make up the parts of your experience, and they're really going to be able to present them both in a professional way, but also in a really powerful way where you never feel like you're kind of hiding parts of yourself as you're really trying to think about both your career and maybe more importantly, the types of impact that you really want to go and have. So as we continue going forward, for anyone who wants to know what we covered in the part 1 of our workshop a few months ago, we really talked about the branding statements, some of the nuances around cover letters and the relational aspect of those, and of course, the dreaded resumes. So if anyone wants to know or get any of the information from that workshop, please feel free to go and to message me offline or talk with our friends over in YNPN. I think we also recorded that session. But today, since we spent that period of time really talking more about, those kind of professional artifacts, today we're really going to talk about interviews. And how we've broken up the time is to spend a little bit of time talking about different interview prep strategies. We're going to help you all on your story selections and help you figure out which stories you actually need to select when you're coming into those interviews and the types of stories you want to have pre-prepared and kind of ready for those interviews, whether they're more formal or informal. We're also going to go and sort of help answer a lot of your tough questions about different techniques and how you can manage your own anxiety. If you're like me, I know that it can be extraordinarily frustrating or extraordinarily scary when you're going into an interview, whether it's for an organization that you currently work with and you're looking for a different type of position or a different role, or maybe just adding a new type of project under your plate. But also it can be a lot of anxiety when you're looking externally at a different organization when maybe you don't know the environment, the culture, and the people as well. So we're going to dive into a lot of that. And then, of course, as we go through this, please ask questions. If you need to pause or interrupt me or poke Phoebe and get her, make sure that she knows that. you have a question, please let me know, because your questions are always going to be more important than the content I have for you. So with that, the one question I love to ask for all of my workshops is just having us go and kind of take a step back from the career space, the professional space, and all the craziness that has happened as we've been thinking about how the pandemic has affected our lives. And I love to go and use a software called Poll Everywhere just to go and to ask the question of, are there any talents, hobbies, new elements about yourself that you've been able to rediscover in these past 2 years of a pandemic? You're free to go and to either like shoot some responses over in the chat, or if you want to be really, really fancy, you can actually go and use this software that we like to use, Poll Everywhere, either by going to this browser over here, pollev.com/AlexBerry174, or you could just go and use a mobile device and text in an answer like someone just went and did. So I'll give it a little bit of time for some of those answers to start coming in. Oh wow! So we have someone who went and kind of started going and swimming to get a little bit of the exercise. I love that. I know we almost always have folks who got really, really into baking and cooking and things of that nature. So I'll give it just a second for some of these stories that are going to come in. Oh, wow. Crocheting, furniture restoration, French piano video. Okay, so a little bit of everything. We have some generalists coming in. I love it. I love it. I know for myself, one of the things I've had to really go and get into is this idea of cooking and being able to actually feed myself in a variety of ways. Seems like we have some more swimming. I see some sourdough bread folks. That's always going to be a popular thing there. Wood burning art. Okay, not quite sure what that is, but that sounds amazing. Learning Russian. I love it. Some long walks with a little bit of cooking there. Excellent. Some sewing there. Oh goodness. Well, this is great. I love to see this because I think for many of you all, even coming to things like this, we do cosplaying video games. Wow. One of the things that I think is really important to recognize as you're thinking about preparing for interviews, preparing for any type of career shift, or just like working on your own sort of storytelling, sometimes we go too far over to the professional angle, and we don't do a good enough job of bringing in our hobbies, bringing in these other more informal ways of how we build skills, how we enforce our own discipline. And the best interviews are always going to be the ones where you can bring in some of those personal aspects and really meld them and merge them with some of those more professional aspects. So I love to see this. I love all this input we have coming in. This is really, really great. I love this. Oh, and shout out to the person who went and declared their house. I might need to go and have a conversation with you about that. I love it. Wow, love the engagement. So let's go and kind of pivot a little bit and let's sort of take a step back, because when we talk about different types of interview strategies, it's so important for us to recognize that there are different types of interviews. In the same way that you don't necessarily go and prepare to dress the same way for different types of occasions. You don't wear the same pajama onesie that you might wear to virtual work as you would go and wear over to a wedding, So it's really, really important for us to be thinking about when we're understanding the different strategies, the different types of preparation, and the different types of techniques that we can use. What are those different interviews? So one of the things that I like to go and how I like to break up the, I guess, most common types of interviews that we'll normally see within our professional careers, there are the interviews that are really related to the learning angle. And I'll talk about that in a second. There are the interviews that are really areas where our stories and the stories that we bring into the interview are the center of attention. And then there are interviews that are really more based off of demonstrating our skills in a variety of ways. So starting over here on the left side, when we talk about these learning interviews, these tend to be those kind of, this maybe 15, 30 minutes. Oftentimes, maybe it's like you might have heard the term like a pre-screen, or talking with someone within an HR organization, or talking with a recruiter at a particular company or organization. And these tend to be just very, very kind of super quick get to know you, wanting to get a little bit of demographic data from you, wanting to make sure that the type of position or the type of role that you're applying for really goes and kind of aligns with some of your goals. They tend to be very, very short. They oftentimes, even in a pre-pandemic era, they tended to be virtual. And they also tended to go and to have a maybe not be the most informative for a candidate. It tends to be something that's more helpful for the actual organization who's really recruiting you. One of the things that's maybe different about a pre-screen interview versus like a much longer interview, so let's say maybe a 45-minute or a 60-minute kind of behavioral interview, is the expectation that's placed on you as an interviewer. For pre-screens, there tends not to be that much preparation you really need to do. If you have a certain idea of the job that you're applying for, you might have a chance to ask a few questions, but really these tend to focus more on what does the organization need to get, what kind of boxes do they need to check to make sure that you're going to be a really amazing candidate for those next rounds of interviews if they have. Now that's a little bit different from the second area that I have over here in the learning bucket, which I like to call the informational interviews. Now, this is really all about you going and saying, what do I want to go and to learn about an organization, about a role, about a person, about a job, about a context. Oftentimes you might go and maybe within your nonprofit careers, you may have gone to develop a special skill set, maybe something around visualizing data, maybe something around managing stakeholders, maybe something around developing funds and developing relationships with different donors. But you might not necessarily have that same content. So maybe you work within the human rights space and you are pursuing an opportunity that's more focused on homelessness or more focused on animal abuse and animal cruelty. So sometimes those informational interviews, which is really where you might go and choose to set up time with someone within an organization in a more informal capacity, and really come to the table with a long list of questions where you get to go and ask, what does this role really require? I understand what the job requisition might say. I understand that there's 1,000 skills that you might want in a candidate, but what does that role really require? You might also go and ask questions about the organization's culture, about the direct team you might be working on. For me, I'm sure there's a few of us here who have spent time over in the development world. It can be very, very different if you're working on development and you're working with like large grant funding organizations, but that can look a little bit different than if you're working with individual donors on a small team. So for you, those informational interviews can be really, really powerful in getting more of that information, right? In terms of what do I need to do to actually perform this job? How do the hours actually look? How does the work-life balance actually look? As well as what's the culture of the team and of the organization. Now, those learning interviews are phenomenally different, again, from the story-based and the skill-based interviews that we'll talk about in a second. But I do want to just kind of pause here because there tends to be lots of questions about informational interviews, about how you set them up, about the purpose and why they're useful. So I want to go and pause here and see if anyone has any questions on the line that you either want to come off of mute and just sort of verbalize them, or just throw them over into the chat and then Phoebe can help you there. So first questions for you all, anything coming to your mind about these sort of learning types of interviews?
Alex, I have a quick question. So I know informational interviews as like more so you're interested in maybe like a specific role type or potentially an organization you kind of want to get in the front door and be on the top of their minds if they do have a job coming up. But the informational interview that you're talking about, it sounds like it would be something that happens after you already apply for a job. Is that correct? That you would like go through that and then reach out and ask them for an informational interview to dig deeper into the culture and things like that?
Ooh, I love that question. That gives me a wonderful opportunity to clarify. Thank you for that, Cassidy. So I personally would go and would recommend doing it if you have the time and if you have the ability and the connections to do those informational interviews, oftentimes before you apply. Particularly for your larger organizations, there has a slight tendency to be sometimes of a disconnect between the person who really went and crafted up a wonderful and an amazing job rec that can go and can ask for many, many things from many different wonderful candidates. And some of those really core pieces of information or those core sort of skill sets that you really, really need to get the job done. So for example, you might be working and supporting a marketing organization within a larger nonprofit, and they might go and ask for marketing skills, communication skills, photo editing skills, audiovisual skills, the ability to set up amazing programming like this. But an informational interview can help you go and find out, well, actually, we're maybe talking about setting up, one or two, large Zoom meetings, a month, but the core part of your responsibilities might be more of in the marketing or the graphic design area. So again, informational interviews, I personally prefer to go and to do them before I even apply, because most of the time it gives a really good feeling of confidence around, oh my gosh, this is a role I can do. Or you might go and say, okay, there are a few gaps that I might go and have, but I've gotten some really good feedback and potentially even mentorship from the individual I talk to of how I can close some of those gaps. Does that answer your question, Cassidy?
It does, thanks.
Awesome, thank you so much for that. Other questions on the line about these two things over here in this sort of learning bucket of interviews?
Alex, we have a question from Laura in the chat. Should I mention that I'm interested in applying to X job when asking for an informational interview? Yeah,
I think that's very, very fair. I think if anything, people will oftentimes be overjoyed that you said, hey, I would love to go and take some time in the front end, learn more about this organization, learn more about this position, learn more about if this role is going to be a good fit. And you also are not under any obligation if you go and you realize, gosh, I talked to Phoebe, I talked to Kalima, and it honestly wasn't a great fit for me. That in itself can be a really, really wonderful piece of learning. I'm sure that many of you all over the last at least 4 to 5 years of your career have gone through different types of interviews and different types of interview processes, and it's draining. So to be able to spend 30 minutes on the front end before the applications, before all the editing of the resume, before some of the things that we find really draining can be really powerful. Great question, Laura. Anything else before we go into like those other two buckets of interviews? And we're really going to focus on the story-based bucket because that's what you are going to probably see most often within your careers. Anything else there in the chat, Phoebe?
Oops, sorry, now I'm unmuted. We just had one more question come in from Megan, which is, culture at an organization is such a hugely important factor in finding a good fit. What are some questions or strategies that are good to gather some of that info?
Oh, wonderful. And we'll keep me honest too, we'll also dive into this a little bit deeper into our workshop today, but to go into address this like in the moment, two questions that I love to go and ask is, first and foremost, what has your best day looked like and what has your worst day looked like within this organization? So, let's say I'm applying for a development associate role, working to go and work with large donors and working to go and to write different types of grants for my organization. And I'm going to be working on a team of, 4 folks, right? I want to know what has that best day looked like? What has been the day that they were most excited, most intrigued, most energized about their work? And then I also want to know, what was that shittiest day like? What was that day that they said, I don't think I can do this? What was that day that was the most draining for them? oftentimes seeing those extremes can be really helpful for you to go and say, man, that person's best day sounds like an absolute nightmare for me. Or that person's worst day, that sounds like something I can manage, right? So that's the first question I like to ask. The second question that I always like to ask tends to be somewhat focused around the pandemic. So for me, I always find it really, really important to know what specifically has your organization or your team done to support your employees during the transition into the COVID working models. Whether your organization is still in person and has had to implement new safety features, whether everyone's working from home and you're trying to figure out how in the world do you build connection and build community, whether it's talking about how you're able to support new employees, whether they're new to the workforce, new out of school, or just new to your organization, it's really important to drive down to the specifics of how is this organization making sure every employee can come and can show up in one of the most difficult working scenarios of our lifetimes. So for me, those two questions are really, really powerful, and they give a person on the other angle a chance to tell some stories that can be really informative and get into some really good specific programs, specific tactics, specific resources that they've offered their employees. And I think that those practices can be a lot more indicative of a culture versus someone saying, yeah, I really like working here. It's a lot of fun. We do a lot of good work. That's not necessarily actionable enough for you to go and to make a decision. So hopefully that helped. Phoebe, anything else over there in the queue before I keep going?
Nothing else.
Awesome. So let's talk about the types of interviews that you all are probably the most familiar with. And this is what I like to call the story-based interviews. And I say story-based because the key to all of these interviews is going to be the stories that you're able to really prepare ahead of time. So we've got behavioral, situational, panel, and consulting. And kind of starting from the top, you all know what behavioral interviews are. These are those questions where you'll hear people say, Phoebe, tell me about a time when you did XYZ. Tell me about a time when you dealt with team conflict. Tell me about a time when you led a transformative program. Tell me about a time when you had to deal with an angry donor. These behavioral interviews tend to be historical or history facing or past facing. They want to know, what types of behaviors did you do? What types of actions did you take in the past to try and get a good sense of what you might do in a current work situation? Situational interviews, very, very similar, right? Situational interviews tend to have questions that revolve around how you would perform in specific situations in the present or in the future. So these questions sound like, hey Phoebe, hey Karima, tell me about us, or tell me what you would do in this situation. Tell me what you would do if you had a $10,000 grant fall through last minute and we were worried about how we were going to fund some of our committed programming. Again, situational interviews and behavioral interviews are similar in that we tend to go and think about how to answer them in the same way, but the core difference is that behavioral interviews tend to be kind of focused on what you have done in the past and your past experiences. Situational interviews are more like, well, what will you do if you're in XYZ situations? Now, we're going to dive into those much, much deeper, but I do want to go and at least touch on the nuances within panel interviews and consulting interviews. So when I say a panel interview, I'm really going and referencing the different dynamics between versus you going and interviewing with someone one-on-one, even whether that's in a virtual or an in-person setting, and being able to just have one person to focus on, one person to understand, one person to engage, versus that panel interview when you've got 1, 2, maybe as many as 5 or 6 folks who are really going and you were kind of in charge of both engaging them as well as answering their questions and hopefully picking up some of the culture and the vibe that you're getting from their interviewing presence. The reason I kind of separate out panel interviews is because for many people, especially in this virtual environment, they tend to drive a different type of anxiety, right? You know, am I looking at this person in the eye when I'm speaking to them, even though they're over here in my Zoom corner, but they don't know that? Am I able to go into sort of really engage and to resonate with each of my different panelists, even though one person might come from a marketing function, another person might come from a development function, another person might come from a volunteer coordinator function, you know? The core thing that I like to think about when it comes to panel interviews, especially when it comes to being able to kind of reduce our anxiety about them, is being able to go and to sometimes ask ahead of time if the person who has helped set up your interview could give you a little bit of background around the folks who you will be meeting with. If you have 3 people who are in front of you, it's really, really helpful to be able to say like, okay, you know, Michelle's coming from a more of an HR kind of background. Maybe Kalima's coming more from a development background. Maybe Tristan's coming more from a fundraising or grant writing background. And it can just be helpful to go into kind of alleviate your anxieties to get a sense of where people are coming from. Now, on the consulting side, what I've gone and kind of lumped into this broad range of interviews, consulting interviews tend to go and to be really, really focused on asking questions that maybe cause you to think outside the box a little bit. There's a lot of overlap within whether they're a story-based interview or what I've defined as a skill-based interview, but essentially those consulting-based interviews might make you kind of feel like I'm really testing how you think. You know, a type of question you might get, you know, 45 minutes to an hour to really go and kind of noodle on could be something like, you know, help me predict, help me understand how we could have an accurate count of all of the homeless / housing unstable folks in the entire Pacific Northwest, right? How would we go about gathering that information? How would we go about combining different government resources and nonprofit resources to get a really good accurate number? In areas like that, it's maybe not as important, you know, what exactly your specific answer is, and it's more important about your thought process and how you really walk your interviewer or interviewers through your process of determining that information. So again, same idea as I did over with the learning bucket. Let me kind of pause here and take some of your questions when it comes to the different types of story-based interviews. Specifically, I expect a lot of things to come around the behavioral area and the situational area, but just want to make sure that we have a chance to clear up any definitional issues here. So Phoebe, anything in the chat, or does anyone want to come off mute and sort of verbalize your question?
Nothing in the chat yet. Although we did have a great comment from Jody as we were, well, you were just talking a few minutes ago about doing warm intros and really trying to connect people to organizations that can do multiple or can do informational interviews. And she just shared that that helps her and that person stay top of mind. And I just thought that was a really helpful tip.
Oh, most definitely. And I think especially for those more story-based interviews where, you know, we're going to talk a little bit later about how you go and figure out which stories you're going to want to bring into these interviews. That informational interview can honestly be a great place to go and say, hey, you know, I'm interviewing for this sort of data visualization role within this nonprofit. Which of these stories kind of really resonate? You know, would you suggest I come and bring in more of the stories that are related to my leadership experience, or do you want to see stories that really emphasize like my emotional intelligence, or do you want to see some of those stories that really reflect some of the more technical type of skills that might apply to the role? So oftentimes those informational interviews can be a great place to source that information. So I love that. Any other questions? Any other questions about this before I touch on the skill base just very briefly?
Nothing else popping up in the chat right now.
Perfect. And then for this particular audience, I won't go too deep into the skill-based interviews. But in general, what you tend to go and see there is, particularly for those of us who are coming from like a really like nerdy or engineering or technical background, you do tend to see these interviews be focused on, don't just tell me about how much you love to use data. Don't just tell me about your ability to create financial, P&L sheets, or your ability to fundraise, or your ability to potentially like write grants. I really want you to show me. So this bucket of interviews is really, really focused on showing people, either in the moment or through different sort of interview challenges, through different demos, about those technical skills. Sometimes you'll see that in the financial world. Sometimes you'll see that over in, the computer science world. But I think the one that might be the most applicable to this group is, especially if you're kind of interviewing for a role, maybe a slightly more senior role, where you might be have a very external facing type of presence, or potentially you're in a more of a senior leadership position. People might go and say, I want to hear you speak. I want to hear you talk. I want to see how you formulate your ideas and really go and sort of tell those stories. So they might go and have you go and spin up a different type of a presentation, sometimes on a topic that's really, really important to you, or potentially on a topic that's really important to the organization. So again, it just gives them a way to get a slightly better feel for, how does Alex show up in this more formal kind of external framework. And so again, those would probably be the most common I might go and see for this particular audience. So before we go and we kind of move into how I would suggest that we really think about preparing, and not so much preparing, but really selecting the types of stories that we would bring in to tackle the story-based interviews. Any other questions before we head out and before we move on? All right. So when we talk about trying to figure out which stories we want to go and bring into these interviews, I like to break it down between the parts of your story that you need to start with, and to figure out what those parts are, what those elements are. It really goes and starts with, what are the people you're talking to going to be listening for, right? That helps us figure out how we want to structure our stories, as well as helps to inform us of which stories we might go and choose to bring in. Oftentimes interviews are time bound, so we don't always have, all the time in the world to go and tell every story that might be as powerful or might be as relevant. So sometimes we do have to go into kind of prepare to go into make some of those choices and trade-offs. So what I really want to go and have us focus on is what we like to go and talk about as like the 4 elements that we tend to either consciously or subconsciously listen for, especially when we're in those more kind of formal interview settings. And how CMD likes to break it down is we like to listen for things around transferable context. We like to listen for things around what we call these demonstrated skills. We tend, especially in the nonprofit and the governmental space, listening for those areas of emotional intelligence and those examples of emotional intelligence. And then, of course, we very naturally listen for what we like to call emotional anchors. So to kind of give an example of this, I wanted to go and just sort of tell a brief story. So one of the things that I've been really excited to be a part of during the pandemic is a global cooking show that I get to go and run with a few friends over at Intel. So long story short, think of an environment like this with hundreds of folks learning from different technologists around the world how to cook different types of meals and things of that nature. And so when going and kind of bring that story into some of the folks who I work for and trying to sort of sell them on it and try to sell them of like why they should support it or why they should, include that as sort of part of my scope of work, it was really, really helpful to go into follow this kind of framework. So my day job at Intel is as a technical program manager. And so it was really helpful to go and say, hey, I'm not only am I going to be a program manager and figure out how to be a program manager for my day job, but there's this wonderful little side opportunity where I'm also performing as that program manager. I'm also managing budget and risk and people. I'm also engaging with different types of stakeholders, and I'm also going and kind of fighting for funding. that very naturally led into this idea of these demonstrated skills, where for myself and my type of work, I have to be really, really good about financial engineering. I've got to be really, really solid when it comes into presentation and different types of storytelling. And I have to have, I don't want to say necessarily a large network, but I have to understand how do you manage the different politics that might go and come in when you're talking about spending millions and millions of dollars around the world. So those demonstrated skills and being able to go and come up with very specific examples of how I was able to grow in that skill set with the side project made it not only a really good story for an interview for any type of program management role, but also really helped make it valuable for the current folks who I work for. On the emotional intelligence side, a lot of what our show was about was maybe less of the technical aspects of cooking, but was a lot more dealing with the creating of a community, right? How do you go in and convince people to engage, not just during our 100, 200 person cooking shows, but how do you convince people to engage throughout the week? How do you go and convince people to share stories about their families and to take a relatively introverted audience, get all those folks to turn on their cameras and show you their houses, or houses, apartments, places of residence, and bringing their families into the picture as they go and as you all cook together, right? And then finally, when we come to those emotional anchors, from a definitional standpoint, when I say emotional anchor, think of those things that naturally connect you to someone else. So think of being in a similar organization, being, for example, associated with YNPN Portland or one of our other YNPN chapters around the country. Think of going and being associated with going to another school that someone went to. Think of going and being from a similar part of the USA. If there's anyone here from Georgia, boom, that's an automatic emotional anchor for me to go and to want to get to know more about your story and how you ended up winding up on this particular Zoom call. So like an emotional anchor that I would go and say, like with this particular cooking program, was being able to go and actually really connect with different folks who, many of the folks who were sort of engaged in this program were transplants over here into the Pacific Northwest. And they hadn't necessarily had a chance to really to go and to engage, at least virtually, in a community of people and learn a different skill. So in our sense, our emotional anchor was really understanding that a lot of people, especially early in the pandemic, were maybe a little bit lonely, maybe felt a little bit isolated, and especially after work, just really didn't have anything that really engaged them and helped to support their healthy life habits. So understanding that there's a sense of isolation that we could really empathize with, and building that into how we talked about our program made it a really, really powerful story. So again, just to recap, you've got, when you go and you structure your stories and making sure your stories include that transferable context, making sure they include those demonstrated skills, making sure it highlights how you're being emotionally intelligent, how you're working with others, how you're going in, at least in our case, dealing with a lot of tricky stakeholders and a lot of tricky people who are very demanding clients and customers in our case, and then being able to really go and to connect people with those emotional anchors. That's what those we're naturally listening for. Those are some of the elements that make a really powerful story. But I want to pause here and kind of get some feedback from the audience. And one of the ways I'm going to go and do that, Phoebe, is I actually have another little poll here, because I always love to know from folks, what is the hardest element for you to communicate when you're thinking about your own stories, when you're thinking about preparing for interviews, or just telling stories to your boss or to your coworkers? So I'll give folks a second to go and kind of answer our poll here. And as the votes going to come in, I would definitely say that for myself personally, it honestly sometimes comes down to those emotional anchors, right? It can be very, very difficult to go into, unless you already know your interviewer or you already know the person you're talking to very well. It almost feels like an accident when you go and you're talking, you realize, oh my gosh, like you are a big soccer fan as well, or oh my goodness, like you are also really into the Kentucky Derby, or wow, one of the folks who went and who sort of answered our first poll question mentioned that they had gotten into wood burning, and someone else said that they were really into art. Someone else mentioned that they'd gotten back into cosplay, right? Those are all things that can help drive those emotional anchors, but it also requires a little bit of emotional vulnerability for yourself to figure out, how do I bring that into an interview, right? How do I kind of bring that personal part of myself that doesn't feel very professional into those interviews? So that tends to be where I lie. Does anyone want to maybe come off mute or put in the chat why transferable context was something that you really struggled with?
This is Jacqueline. I would be happy to expand a little bit on why I said transferable content. For me, I think it's figuring out sort of what it is. When you see a job description and maybe you research the position that you're interested in, you can get a pretty good feel most of the time for what people are looking for. But a lot of times the list is real long. And figuring out, narrowing down, what are the things that are really valuable to the person who's interviewing me, and how do I take what I have already and make it relatable to this position? Which thing do I choose, and how do I weave it in to make it fit with the needs that they've listed in the job description? And that's always a tricky thing to navigate for me, or it has been in the past.
I would 100% agree with you on that assessment, Jacqueline. It definitely sometimes feels like, you're asking for absolutely everything, and it can make it hard for us to figure out what's actually valuable. Do I really need to know this governmental software, or is that the kind of thing that I can really learn on the job and it's really more of a preferred thing? And that's when we go back to those informational interviews that we'd mentioned beforehand. Being able to go, and even before you apply for those roles, being able to go and to reach out to folks. And sometimes, whether looking at the actual job description itself, or looking at especially when you see certain jobs posted on LinkedIn or on different job boards, sometimes, not all the times, but sometimes they'll be linked to either hiring managers, or they will be linked to people within the organization, or there will be certain info sessions related to the role where they say, hey, come ask us anything, bring us your questions. And that's really, really the time to be able to go and to kind of dive into, do you really need A, B, and C? Or would you love to have someone who's great at A, someone who's okay at B, and someone who's maybe not so great at C? The other thing to think about as well, especially because oftentimes we don't always have, when you're in the moment, when you're in and someone has gone and asked you a question, you're like, oh, dang, I've got two great stories to answer that, and I'm not sure which one's going to resonate the most. Sometimes just taking a step back within the interview and going and asking the person who is working with you and saying, hey, so Jacqueline, I've got two good stories. One of them's about maybe a time that sort of shows, this particular context, and another one maybe goes and shows this other context. Which one do you feel might go and really go and get to answering your question? So sometimes going and kind of throwing it back on the interviewer to kind of help you out a little bit can actually be a sign of your own emotional intelligence and understanding that we're really trying to figure out what is the interviewer listening for.
Awesome, thank you.
Does anyone else want to go and talk a little bit about why they might be struggling on the transferable context area or on the emotional anchors area? Anyone else want to go and have some thoughts?
I can. It's another transferable context one. I'm in grants. Well, I'm on the program side, but I'm in grants management now. But one of the issues I had was I worked retail for a really long time, and I did a lot of things in retail. So it's really hard. It was really hard to describe what I did when it had nothing to do with a job, but has something directly to do with the job. And also in grants, people fall into grants management. There's not really a certification, and I can't really say I have an education around it because it's something people seem to fall into. And then now I've been at my position for longer, and I have I have a lot of non I don't know how to describe it, but I'm not in a leadership role, but I have internal leadership. So trying to talk about how I lead from the position that I'm in is something that I struggle with now.
Mm. And so I feel like one of the things, and that's very, very similar to what I've heard in, you know, similar types of workshops. One of the things that is kind of I'm pulling an answer from a previous participant who actually sort of relayed this to me, and I'll share it with you all, is being able to go and to think about not just like the role you're in, but to really go and think about the skills that you've gained within that role. So for example, when you were going from retail and trying to get into grants management, right? What about when you sort of, instead of thinking about like sort of what you were doing on a day-to-day basis, and instead thinking about, okay, what were some of the core skills you were building? So were you building skills in customer and relationship management? How does that transfer over to grants? Were you building skills over in budgeting and financial management? How does that transfer over to grants? Were you building skills in being extremely detail oriented? How does that go and transfer over to grants, right? And then now when you're thinking about, you know, not just for yourself, but for everyone on the line, when you're thinking about what that next place, what that next opportunity might look like, it might be going and doing a very similar thing. Okay, so as someone who has that grants manager background, but also has these other kind of leadership components where there's, you know, there's an event here, there's a programming thing here, there's a helping to support one of the directors of your organization in a very tricky situation. Are you building up your emotional intelligence? Are you building up your ability to present? Are you building up your ability to do very specific types of conflict resolution? And are you building up your ability to manage a team, even if your title is not grants team manager? Because oftentimes being able to get out of, okay, what am I doing on a day-to-day basis? And be able to think about, okay, over these last 3 months, over these last 6 months, over these last 18 months, what are the 3 or 4 kind of core skills I've been able to develop? And can I tell 1 or 2 stories about those skills? Might just be a slightly better way to look at it and to help address your issue with the transferable context. But does that make sense, Jody?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Kathleen, too, about the accreditation down there. Appreciate it.
I love that. I love that. Now, Phoebe, before I go and move forward, are there any other kind of questions in the chat that you think I should go in and address before moving on?
Nope, nothing else in the chat. Thanks, Alex.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you for keeping me honest. So now I want to talk a little bit about, you know, if you believe in me, that, you know, we tend to go and have these sort of 4 elements that we're really listening for as human beings. You know, again, the transferable contents, the demonstrated skills, the emotional intelligence, and the emotional anchors. And you're thinking about, okay, so knowing that, Alex, what story should I select, right? How can, you know, I've got anywhere from 5 months to 50 years of experience to draw upon, maybe more than that. How do I figure out what stories are going to bring in? And what I like to go and think about is having at least 1 story that goes and kind of answers the questions within each of these 3 dimensions. Or as I like to go and say, when you put on pants, leave the apartment, leave the house, leave your place of residence, you always want to go and have that leadership story, that team story, and that story that talks about your domain expertise. Specifically, when I say a leadership story, I want a story where you are telling me how you went and led something, how you were able to, especially informally, influence a decision, how you go and communicate, especially when you're communicating bad news. That's something I personally really struggle in. And then especially in a kind of COVID and pandemic context, how do you make tough decisions, right? You want a leadership story that helps you answer and address any of these points. Especially when it comes to being able to go and to talk about how you're able to make tough decisions. Those tend to really, really resonate with folks who are, you know, trying to figure out, you know, if you can make a tough decision in this situation, what type of framework, what type of ideology, what type of mental process are you going to have for the tough decisions we need to make over in this organization? When I go and I look at the second type and the second bucket of stories around teamwork, specifically, I don't necessarily mean like, tell me about a story when you're, on a team and you're working together. Those are important, don't get me wrong, but what's more helpful, what's more actionable is understanding what type of role do you like to play on your team. So we might be on a volunteer coordinator team, right? We're working for a nonprofit that maybe has, 10 paid staff, but we have 300 volunteers that we love and cherish because they really help us go and have the impact we want. Well, on that team of volunteer coordinators, are you the person who loves to be the coach? Are you the person who loves to really encourage and inspire everyone else to bring out their best selves? Are you someone who's just really good about kind of putting your head down, getting through the emails, getting through the work, kind of dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's? Are you someone who's very comfortable with being the star player, maybe taking on a little bit more work because you're able to work really fast and really quickly? Are you maybe kind of like how I see myself at work, where I'm a bit more of a support character? I really like going around and kind of mopping up after other folks' messes. To use a basketball analogy, I'm not the person making all the initial 3-point shots. I'm the person kind of getting the rebounds and sort of getting the hustle points. There's never a right or a wrong answer with the type of role that you like to play when it comes to a team, but having stories that help to illustrate this can be really, really insightful, because it helps to go and kind of tell about your value set. It helps to tell about how you resolve conflict. It helps you very naturally tell stories about what you're going to do when you're put on a team and be put in a particular environment. So again, nothing wrong with the classic teamwork stories, but I find it a little bit more helpful to go and have a story that really highlights the role that you like to play on a team. Now, the last thing I'll say about this is that there's a difference in the role that you like to play on a team and the role that you always get stuck in playing on the team. So there is that difference, right? Just like there's a difference between the things that you might be really, really good at and the skills you're good at, and the skills that actually really energize you. For myself, I'm relatively okay at teaching complex technical concepts, but I find that very, very draining, right? I'm good at it, but I find it draining. So I don't necessarily want to go and have my day job to be teaching different types of, scientific concepts to high school students, right? I definitely value that experience. I definitely feel like I would have some competencies that would allow me to do it. But if I'm honest, I would walk away every day very, very drained. And that's going to really go and kind of grate against the gears. And then finally, this sort of third bucket of stories, the domain expertise. If you are coming from the grant writing world, this is a story about how you were able to go and to maybe successfully go and write a grant. If you're coming from the volunteer coordinator world, this is a story about how you're able to work with volunteers, gain more volunteers, retain volunteers, especially in a pandemic, create new types of volunteer opportunities. If you're within a leadership position within a nonprofit, maybe this is a story about how you're able to keep the morale up, as well as to make sure that your service delivery models haven't been too drastically impacted during the pandemic. So again, the domain expertise story, that's really going to change depending on the type of role you're going for, but you just want to be able to bring the story to the table that really shows that you're really strong in that area, or you have the potential to be strong in that area. So let me kind of pause here, because I know I just did a lot of talking. I want to get some feedback from you all in terms of figuring out whether or not you even have that ready to go leadership story, you have that teamwork story, or you have that kind of domain expertise story. So I would love to hear from even one or two people on the line in terms of what struggles you might have when you're trying to think about the stories that might fit into these different buckets.
Yeah, I can speak to some of that. So somewhat maybe similar to Jody, I also worked in retail for a long time, right? Through college. And so usually I because I was young and in college, you know, the room for advancement was not quite there. So when you're then going out into the world and trying to do all these things, you know, you realize you might not have the stories. I personally worked through like, well, I don't have the hands-on experience, but I did learn from observation, like situations that I would have handled differently if I was in a leadership position, and then just kind of talk through, you know, some things that you've seen, and then highlight how what you would have done differently speaks to your strengths, and then using that to connect to real situations that you've lived through. So you kind of get through that in like a weird kind of way that I've found to have worked, because I think the leadership thing, especially and overseeing people, it really just depends. I'll put in a plug for like volunteering is also a good way to oversee that, right? If you aren't getting necessarily paid, but maybe you volunteer for an organization and you oversee their group of volunteers. Like, I think when we work on our, you know, trajectory, finding those pits and seeing if there's ways you can combat them. So my 2 cents.
No, I love that, Kalima. I think you also brought up a really good point that particularly in the leadership bucket, what most people think of is what's that experience where I had the right title. And then because I had the title, someone came to me to make XYZ decision. Instead of saying, what is that story or that experience where I was put in a difficult decision and I had to demonstrate those leadership competencies. Don't get me wrong, sometimes the title can go and can help. But when you're really trying to go into demonstrate, especially in an interview setting, I would definitely go and argue that similar to Kalima, you know, a volunteer experience, right? Or especially if you're a volunteer and maybe you're helping to manage and support other volunteers, that's even a trickier kind of task, if you will, than when you are getting paid to go and to inspire other paid people, right? So never necessarily discount those volunteer experiences, whether it's going and being able to support different nonprofits, or even when you're thinking about some of those experiences as you went through and maybe matriculated through your academic career. For those of us who were able to finish high school, college, and potentially even postgraduate opportunities, sometimes those what we feel like are the more informal experiences are the things that build the foundation for how do you make decisions, how do you communicate bad news, how do you figure out what you're actually good at and what energizes you. So never necessarily go and discount that. Did anyone else want to go and potentially have something to share about how they might struggle with coming up with stories in one of these 3 buckets? And if not, Phoebe, could you go and check the chat for me and see if we had any other questions related to these like different types of stories that I would definitely propose that we all go and kind of carry with us.
Sure. No questions in the chat right now.
Awesome. All right, so folks, the last thing that I'll go and I'll say about this is a common question that we do go and see is, okay, so let's say I've went to this workshop, and I sat down and I kind of penciled in, I looked at some of my different experiences, looked at some of my favorite projects from a professional as well as maybe a personal context. And I've got one leadership story. I've got kind of one story that really talks about, me resolving conflict and me working a team. But I noticed that leadership story also kind of is also the domain expertise story. Is that a problem? Is that an issue? And from my personal standpoint, I would say no. Oftentimes, folks, especially for folks who are maybe younger within their careers, their favorite and their most impactful stories might satisfy multiple of these buckets. And so one thing that they have to really think about and that we might have to be cognizant of is, are you going into the interview and you're like, I got this one thing I can talk about and that's all I got. That actually might be in itself kind of a driver of different types of anxiety to feel like, oh man, I'm going to get 5 to 6 to 8 questions. I only have one thing that I'm really proud of to talk about. And that might maybe take a little bit more introspection for you to go and think about, okay, do I need to look beyond some of the things in my professional career? Do I need to look beyond sort of maybe my current job and maybe go back a little bit into how I show up both for work, for social engagements, for different types of informal leadership opportunities. But in essence, it's not a major issue if some of your stories overlap in these buckets. But what is really important is being able to have at least one story that you feel really satisfies the leadership angle, the team role angle, and the domain expertise. What that allows you to do is to be able to go, and particularly when it comes to behavioral and situational interviews, it really allows you to not necessarily have to study 200 or 300 types of questions that they could potentially ask you. And instead, you can be a little bit more on the fly, a little bit more, maybe not improvisational, but a little bit more flexible. And when you get that question that's asked about a time when you had to make a tough decision, when you get that question that's asking about your greatest strengths and your greatest weaknesses, you were able to go and to kind of pull very quickly from one of these different sort of pre-prepared buckets and say, oh my goodness, this is where my teamwork story is going to be amazing. Or this is where my leadership story is really going to shine. Or this is where my domain expertise story is really going to shine. So having those three stories kind of pre-prepared definitely helps you be a lot more powerful. One of the other things that we commonly mention too, in terms of like the actual structuring of these stories. So many of us are very familiar, especially when it comes to preparing for behavioral and or situational interviews, what we would go and call like the STAR methods. So figuring out how to go and sort of conceive of not just the overall context around the story that you're bringing, but also helping people understand what was the problem you were solving, what were the actions you were taking, and what were the results that you were trying to go and to accomplish, or what results you did go and accomplish. But another thing to also go and think about is it's really helpful when your stories go and kind of have what I like to call like that past, that present, and that future. So when you think of this from a past standpoint, when you're answering the question of, Kalima, Phoebe, Tristan, tell me about yourself. The story can feel a little bit lacking if you leave out some of the elements of yourself of what you've been doing. Many of us have had employment gaps during the pandemic at absolutely no fault of our own. And so instead of going and feeling very nervous or very uncomfortable about an employment gap, being able to go and to really go and say, well, during this time frame, here's, one or two things I was able to go and really learn. Here's one or two areas I was able to go and really focus on. Here's a few skills or a few certifications I was able to go and really kind of go after. So you don't feel for yourself that you were maybe wasting that time in the past, but you're really instead preparing for this particular interview moment. Oftentimes when we go and we come to our present, there are some folks who are maybe really, really proud of the projects that they've done in their past, and they have a great sense of where they're trying to go in the future and how their past is going to apply to their future. But maybe they struggle because their current role isn't really bringing out their best of their skill set, or their current role isn't really taking advantage of those kind of past competencies that they've developed. And then finally, oftentimes for people who are struggling to figure out what that next step looks like, what that future step might look like, you might be really, really confident with the skills that you've been able to acquire over the past, year, 5 years, decades of work. You might be really comfortable in your job. You might say, I actually really like my job and I really like the type of impact I'm able to make. But when it comes to the next step, it might feel very scary or very full of ambiguity. But when your career stories are able to help go and to at least touch on both the different skills that you've been able to develop in the past, bring in the types of things that you've learned in the present. So if it's not necessarily like what you're doing currently, if it's what you learned about your role. So have you learned the types of work you're good at and the types of work you're not so great at? Have you learned the types of work that energizes you today and the types of work that has drained you today? And can you use that to help narrow down the types of work you would really love to do in the future? Being able to structure your stories so that they kind of include that past, present, and future can make them a lot more powerful and a lot more helpful. what many of you all are also very familiar with is that sort of STAR method that's commonly taught. There's lots of different iterations of this, but one of the most common teachings of this, especially when you're approaching a behavioral interview type of question. So, tell me about a time when you had to create a new program. You will oftentimes start off by describing the situation and the context, really helping to go and to give folks a slightly better background on, the story you're telling. Then oftentimes people sort of expect you to go and say, from that, there are particular tasks, and this is actually out of order, so forgive me for that, but oftentimes after that kind of contextual background, you'll talk about the different tasks that you went and actually did. So, what was the specific problem you had to face? What was the specific challenge you need to go and take care of? Then you come back up here to the actions that you specifically took, whether those were different skills you implemented, different conflict resolution actions you took. It could be as simple as putting a meeting on someone's calendar and helping them to diffuse a really tricky situation. Or maybe you were able to use other different types of tools and skills to go and to take care of a problem, or at least to kind of mitigate the problem. And then finally, you'll oftentimes hear people go and talk about the results, right? This doesn't have to be extremely quantified. Sometimes the results is you were able to build a better relationship with someone. Sometimes the results are that you were able to fundraise another $20,000 more than you thought you would. But whether the results are quantifiable or they have more of a qualitative aspect, it's really important to go and to emphasize how the actions that you took to address the different problems and tasks that you were faced had that positive result, or at the very least had a really positive learning. So I want to go and see if anyone has any questions about this specifically, besides the fact that the tasks and the actions are kind of out of order. But specifically when it comes to implementing that STAR method, I want to hear from anyone in the audience if they've had trouble really figuring out how to go and structure their stories.
I have a story situation that I've used in the past that I'm just unsure if it's really the best one, but I feel like it personally was really impactful.
Mm-hmm.
So the first time I had to fire somebody was, it was really upsetting for me, but it was a team effort. I spoke with my colleagues. We thought of alternative courses of action, and then eventually came to the conclusion that this person was just not a good fit. And it was a huge learning moment for me and a big step in my career, especially in a leadership position. But I always wonder, is that kind of negative? Is that something that I should steer away from? Or do you think that demonstrates a good example of something?
So I would go and argue that's a wonderful example of what could go and be seen as like either that leadership story or that sort of team role story. So for example, if you're able to go and to demonstrate like this was a tough decision, I don't think I've ever met anyone in my life who's like, wow, I just enjoy firing people. It's the best part of my job. But being able to walk people through both the situational context as well as the emotional context of what you and the team had to work through is a great way to bring to light, okay, this is how Jacqueline communicates. This is how Jacqueline makes decisions. This is how Jacqueline goes and gets other team members on board to make and to execute really, really tough decisions. So from my perspective, that's a great story. One of the things you might have to go and think about though is, are you using that to go and to answer questions related to how you resolve conflict, how you make tough decisions? Or are you bringing that story when they're maybe going and asking you about, how is your financial literacy? How is, are they asking you more about your skills, or are they asking you more about those more communicative and leadership competencies? But overall, I think that's a fine story.
Thank you. That's a good perspective. Using it in the right moment. That's the key.
Alex, we have a question in the chat from Ashley.
Yeah.
Asking how long should your story be overall? I worry about being too long-winded.
Ooh, I love that. I love it. So as an engineer, I really thought that I could go and like come up with a formula to give you like the perfect answer, like, okay, 2 minutes and 13 seconds for every story. I really thought that there was a perfect answer, and unfortunately, there's not one. But one thing that you can do to get a sense of, as around how long that story should be, like if you want to give yourself kind of like that benchmark. So in the same way how Jacqueline just went and almost kind of walked us through a really short version of her story in 30 seconds, you know, in most kind of 30 to 45-minute, behavioral interviews, you're going to have time to go over, 5 to 7 questions. So you're really probably going to want to make sure that those stories are, less than, 3 to 4 minutes, as well as you want to figure out how are you able to go into invite your interviewer kind of into that story. So one thing that I like to go and do after telling a story or answering an interview question is I always like to check back with my interviewer and say, hey, did that answer your question, or are there any kinds of clarifications I can go and make? Because sometimes I can be a little bit long-winded, and I always want to make sure I don't sort of talk so long that I forget your original question. So sometimes being able to go and kind of validate with your interviewer and making sure that they got the information that they needed, or that to give them an opportunity to ask clarifying questions or to sometimes go deeper, can be really, really great. Because then if the interviewer is saying, oh my gosh, actually, I really want to know a little bit more about that picture on the left, Alex, are you in the US? Are you in China? What's the meaning behind the plates? What's going on? It gives them an opportunity to really go and to help drive that conversation and to show where they're engaged. So hopefully that goes and helps a little bit. But if you had to put a number on it, probably around that, like, 3 or so minutes, because you never want to feel like you're just doing all the talking in an interview. Oftentimes, especially for behavioral and situational interviews, that back and forth dialogue makes it feel a little bit more natural and makes you feel like you're not just under a spotlight. Great question there. Anything else in the chat, Phoebe, before I head out or before I move on?
No other questions in the chat.
Awesome. Great questions, folks. Keep them coming. One of the other sort of talking points that we have, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but the other sort of clarifying point that we often tend to make when it comes to the best stories, the most memorable stories, or the stories that are the stickiest, the stories that really stick within an interviewer's mind, we tend to use structures and frameworks like the STAR method to make our stories really, really clear. We tend to go and make sure that we practice our stories, or, kind of like think about them ahead of time so that they can be, relatively concise, right? If you only go in and you tell that one story and you spend 25 minutes telling one story to an interviewer, they might not go and have the opportunity to delve more into all the different things that you bring to the table, right? So we do sometimes want to go and sort of err on the side of our stories being more on the concise side. But, and this really goes to the point that Jacqueline went and brought up, when you want to have that really memorable story, a story that goes and shows your courage, a story that goes and shows you maybe making a difficult decision, or a story that maybe goes and shows that you failed at something, but you were able to learn from it. Those are the stories that we really remember. Those are the stories that we love to hear. And that's not to say that you should go into every interview saying like, hey, my name's Alex. I'm bad at all of these various things related to math and science. And here are all the stories that exemplify how I fail in them. Instead, though, being able to go and kind of take a step back and say, hey, my name's Alex. Math wasn't necessarily my strong suit in high school. And what I had to do to be able to keep up was seek mentorship, get a lot of tutoring, ask my friends for support, trade history and literature lessons for math lessons. And now I'm able to be the engineer that I am today because of that understanding, So that's really where we want to go and think about how we go and we talk about those stories. So again, really focusing there on being a little bit courageous and again, taking some of those emotional risks to be a little bit vulnerable, but those tend to be a lot more memorable for your interviewers. Any questions about this? We tend to go and hear a lot of chatter in terms of like, how courageous is too courageous, right? How dramatic is too dramatic to go and to bring into that professional setting? So I want to see if we have any questions either on the chat or on the line.
No questions in the chat right now.
All right. So one of the things that one of the types of questions, just to kind of give it a sense of the type of psychology around various questions that I want you all to be thinking about. One of the most common things that people, I guess, are afraid of being asked. You tend to have, what's your biggest weakness? What's your biggest flaw? What's your biggest deficit? What's a project that you failed in? And then you have other kind of open-ended questions that's like, Phoebe, tell me about yourself. Laura, tell me about yourself. Alex, tell me about yourself. And when you're attacking these questions, and attacking might be a bit of a strong word, but when you're approaching these questions, what I want you all to really remember is that an interviewer is not necessarily out to get you, right? These are not necessarily stress interviews where they're trying to figure out, how are you feeling? They're not looking for things that are wrong with you. Most interviewers are having a much more holistic process where they're trying to go and say, oh my gosh, Phoebe's great at this, and Phoebe's great in this. Oh, and Phoebe is learning and developing in this area. So when you're answering a question like, what's your biggest weakness? I like to go into imagine how can you use, kind of like a U-shaped method where maybe you start off talking about, what that weakness is, what that flaw is, what that, poor project is. And then you walk people through how you learn from that weakness, how you mitigate that weakness, how you learn from that failure, how you were able to build resilience off of doing something that was not in your expertise. And just like if you imagine a you in your mind, you help you transition that you and to be able to end your story by saying, and now that I have been working on these skills to go into mitigate this weakness, and now that I've taken these learnings from this failure and I'm applying them to these other dimensions, or at least in my case where I work with a lot of projects, some that are very successful and some not so much. Hey, I'm actively learning from this current project that's not doing so well, and I'm applying those learnings to these other projects to help make them more successful and to grow some of my junior program managers. So for those questions that are asking about things that you're bad at, things that you're failing at, the point of a question is not for you to go and to share all of your weaknesses. The point of a question is to see if you understand that you're not the best at everything, and that you need help, and you need to be able to articulate where you need help, where you've gotten help, and how you can translate that to a positive, how you can translate that to the next types of things you need to learn. There's other type of open-ended questions, so but tell me about yourself. People oftentimes feel like that tends to be a bit of a gotcha question, or, tell me about your number one superpower. Where honestly, folks over in the interviewing youth are much more so focused on what are you going to get them, right? Just like if I gave you a blank sheet of paper and I said draw anything, the information I have to go off of is going to be the information you give me. So that's almost like an open invitation to say, you define where you want this interview to go. You define the things that you feel are most important to share with me, whether those are personal things or professional things.
And Alex, we have about 3 minutes left, so I want to call attention to two things so we can respect people's time and end. Amanda Sharp has put in the chat, would you say that displaying personal insight and self-awareness is just as important as the content of the story itself when answering these questions? I'm going to put that out. And then Jody, maybe for a follow-up, Alex, if you have any suggestions about questions, like when people are like, hey, do you have any questions for us? Maybe we'll send that in the follow-up email just for the sake of time.
Yeah, and we're doing great on time there, so thank you for keeping me honest there, Kalima, because this was actually my last slide. But going, and can you repeat that first question that you mentioned?
Yes. What would you say that displaying personal insight and self-awareness is just as important as the content of the story itself when answering the questions?
I would say yes, but something else to also go and think about is that when we're thinking about the stories that we go in that we bring in, the personal insight is going to be the most helpful when I'm thinking of, like, if I'm hiring someone who's going to be working with me on a day-to-day basis, that personal insight, me being able to kind of appropriately dive into someone's mind, is going to be extremely helpful, right? If would love to have someone who can go and who could help write grants, for example, that's a skill that people can learn both in formal and informal ways, but that doesn't necessarily tell me how they do it or how they approach it or what's going on in their mind and hearts. So bringing in that personal insight and that personal awareness and introspectiveness is very, very much kind of a +1 or a +2 that oftentimes gives more insight to an interviewer than they expect. So definitely go and do that.
Perfect.
Yeah,
I mean, Alex, closing thoughts, because we have exactly 1 minute before we wrap up and excuse people.
Yeah, I think the only closing thoughts is when it comes to, and this is again very much like the last thing that we've gotten and kind of touched upon, when it comes to managing that different types of interview anxiety, the best thing and really the only thing you really need to think about is how you prepare is definitely going to go and to help mitigate a lot of that anxiety. So if you're able to set up some of those informational interviews ahead of time, prepare some of those stories, really take your time with some of the different questions, right? Just because someone asks you a question doesn't mean you have to answer right there on the spot. Those few things right there can actually help really manage and lower your anxiety as you go through the different types of interview process. But with that, that's really all I have. If there are any final questions over in the chat, I definitely will be happy to go in and take 1 or 2 of them, even if I need to stay a few minutes over, but that's really all I have for folks.